The air in Ouagadougou was still yet charged, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Then a single voice broke it. "Attention," he said calmly. "What you are about to hear may change the way you see West African politics." For months, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had remained quiet, moving between military briefings and reconstruction plans, speaking little to the media. But this week, that silence shattered. Sitting before a group of reporters, he spoke with the tone of a man who had decided he would rather face the fire than live with deceit. In his hands, he held documents he described as classifies, and what he revealed next sent shockwaves through embassies across the region. He accused a neighboring government, specifically the administration of President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire, of protecting and even financing those who seek to destabilize Burkina Faso. These were not vague political statements. Traoré named the threat plainly. The enemies of Burkina are there, protected, housed, paid, and secure. The press room went silent. For the first time, the tension between two of West Africa's most interconnected nations was no longer hidden under diplomatic smiles. It was open, raw, and dangerous. To those who know the region, this is more than a story about politics. It's a story about survival. Families divided across borders, soldiers who don't sleep at night, leaders who must choose between compromise and conviction. So the question now is not just whether Ibrahim Traoré is right, but whether Africa is ready to face what he just exposed. If Côte d'Ivoire truly harbors those plotting against its neighbor, then peace in the Sahel is hanging by a thread. Do you believe that President Traoré's revolution can withstand such storms, or has the war for African sovereignty already begun inside African borders? Please share this video if you feel that you are one of the first to truly understand what's unfolding in Burkina Faso. Subscribe if you believe that the truth, not the headlines, deserves to be heard. At first, the relationship between Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire seemed cordial, even promising. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power in September 2022, one of the very first foreign leaders to call him was President Alassane Ouattara. His brother even visited Ouagadougou twice. The air was cautious but hopeful. Two neighboring nations tied by history, trade, and millions of families who crossed their borders every day appeared ready to cooperate. But behind the smiles, something was quietly breaking. He wanted us to follow a certain direction, Traoré later recalled. But as revolutionaries, we are not here for that. Revolution means rupture. Those words marked the beginning of an invisible war, one not fought with guns or sanctions, but with alliances, loyalties, and betrayals. For nearly 2 years, Burkinabè intelligence observed a troubling pattern. Individuals wanted by their own justice system, accused of organizing attacks, supplying weapons, or funding insurgent groups, had fled to Côte d'Ivoire. They were not hiding in the shadows. According to Traoré, they were being hosted, secured, and even paid. "We have spoken to them several times," he said of the Ivorian authorities, "but nothing changes." This wasn't a diplomatic misunderstanding. It was a confrontation of worldviews. Traoré's government, committed to rooting out foreign-backed insurgents and reclaiming sovereignty, saw the alleged protection of these destabilizers as a direct act of hostility. Meanwhile, from the Ivorian perspective, granting asylum or simply turning a blind eye might have seemed like political neutrality. But in West Africa, neutrality can be fatal. The tipping point came when Traoré publicly declared that the Ivorian power flirts with the terrorists. That single statement electrified the region. It implied not only complicity, but an unspoken pacte de non-aggression, a kind of unwritten understanding between certain armed groups and Ivorian forces. If that's true, he warned, then this country has become a rear base. And if it stops benefiting from this arrangement, it will be attacked and it will collapse. For ordinary citizens, especially the hundreds of thousands of Burkinabè workers living in Côte d'Ivoire, these words hit deeply. Many have families on both sides of the border. Some have sons in the Burkinabè army and cousins working in Ivorian cocoa fields. The fear that a political rift could turn into violence was real, and for many elders who still remember the civil wars of the early 2000s, it was hauntingly familiar. When asked whether he was worried about Côte d'Ivoire's upcoming presidential election, Traoré didn't hide his concern. "Yes, because we have many compatriots there. We fear violence." His tone was not hostile, it was almost weary. A man who had seen too much war to ignore what was coming. But his warning did not end there. He expanded the conversation beyond Côte d'Ivoire, pointing to a broader pattern across West Africa, a tightening ring of military presence surrounding the AES alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. "It's logical that they try to encircle us," he said. "They fight for their interests, and we must prepare to defend ours." In one sweep, he linked domestic security, regional politics, and global power interests, suggesting that what looked like local friction was part of a much larger design. For Traore, Burkina Faso's revolution was not just against terrorism, but against dependency itself, against a system that expected African nations to stay weak, disarmed, and obedient. Some say our diplomacy is too harsh, he concluded, but we are not here to please anyone. We are here to speak the truth. It was a defining moment, one that made clear this was no longer about borders, but about identity. Burkina Faso was staking its claim as a sovereign state in a region still haunted by the ghosts of colonial diplomacy. And once you declare a revolution, there is no turning back. The air in the press room grew heavy as Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward, his tone shifting from explanation to accusation. "Let's stop lying to ourselves," he said sharply. "The enemies of Burkina Faso are there, clearly visible, protected, paid, and well-housed." The journalists froze. No one expected the young captain to cross that line so publicly. It was not the language of diplomacy. It was the language of a man who had seen betrayal up close. Within hours, foreign embassies began sending coded cables to their capitals requesting clarifications. Some called it reckless, others called it historic. That moment became the turning point, the climax of a growing storm. For years, West African politics had been governed by soft tones and hidden tensions. But now Traoré had broken that unwritten rule. He was not merely defending his country. He was calling out what he described as a pacte de non-aggression between certain governments and the very terrorists destabilizing the Sahel. "Do you think," he asked the reporters, "that the Ivorian army is so powerful that terrorists simply dare not touch them?" No, there is an agreement, and such a pact is dangerous because when the money stops, the terror will turn inward. The room fell silent again. Those words carried weight not only for Côte d'Ivoire, but for every state accused of playing both sides in the Sahel's endless war. It was a challenge, almost a prophecy, a warning that peace built on hypocrisy is peace waiting to explode. Outside Burkina Faso, the reactions were immediate. In Abidjan, the Ivorian press called the remarks provocations. The government issued a brief statement emphasizing respect for bilateral cooperation, but avoided direct denial, a silence that spoke volumes. On social media, young Burkinabè and Ivorians clashed in heated debates. One side accused the other of betrayal, the other spoke of paranoia and propaganda. Inside Burkina Faso, however, the mood was different. Many saw Traoré's outburst not as recklessness, but as courage. In the crowded markets of Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, people repeated his phrases with pride. "Enfin un président qui parle vrai," one shopkeeper said. "Finally, a president who speaks the truth." That emotional resonance mattered. For a population that had endured years of insecurity, foreign interventions, and false promises, Traoré's words felt like a declaration of dignity. He was saying out loud what many Africans whispered privately, that the region's endless wars often survive because someone somewhere profits from instability. Internationally, analysts in Paris and Washington tried to interpret his message. Was it a calculated strategy to shift blame, or was it the voice of a leader who had simply had enough Western diplomats used to polite African leaders avoiding controversy struggled to read him? "He doesn't play the usual game," one European envoy admitted. "He doesn't seek approval, he seeks transformation." At the same time, the AES alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger publicly backed Traoré's position. They issued joint statements condemning the double standards of neighboring regimes and reaffirmed their commitment to mutual defense. What had begun as one man's accusation was quickly becoming a bloc-wide doctrine: no negotiation with those who protect destabilizers, no alliance with those who compromise sovereignty. But the tension carried risk. Each word Traoré spoke further isolated Burkina Faso from traditional regional structures. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, warned against statements that could inflame instability. Yet behind closed doors, even some of its diplomats admitted that the Burkinabè leader had touched a nerve, exposing an uncomfortable truth long ignored by foreign powers. For Traoré, the confrontation was never about personal rivalry with Alassane Ouattara. It was about the principle of African integrity, about whether African nations would continue to outsource their security and morality to others or stand their ground no matter the cost. And in that moment, as he finished his statement and the cameras clicked, the message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso would rather face isolation than betrayal. When the echo of President Traoré's words faded from the press room, it left behind a silence that reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. What he had unleashed was not just a diplomatic quarrel, it was the unraveling of a fragile regional balance that held millions of lives in its grasp. Within days, border towns along the Côte d'Ivoire frontier began to feel the tension. Merchants who once crossed freely with goods and livestock now found their trucks delayed at checkpoints. Drivers whispered that customs officers had new instructions. Be vigilant with anything from Burkina. Families divided across borders felt it most. In Bobo Dioulasso, where almost every household has a relative in Abidjan, phone calls grew shorter, colder. Don't mention politics, one mother told her son over the phone. Just stay safe. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré's declaration ignited both pride and apprehension. On one hand, citizens praised his courage. Local radio hosts repeated his lines about diplomatie mensongère, turning them into slogans of independence. On the other, civil servants and business owners worried about the cost of standing alone. Côte d'Ivoire remains one of Burkina Faso's largest trading partners, providing access to ports and essential imports. Revolution is noble, said a trader from Ouattara, but hunger is real. The government, however, appeared unmoved. Instead of retreating, Traoré doubled down. He framed the diplomatic rift as part of a broader encirclement strategy, an attempt by foreign-backed regimes to weaken the AES alliance from all sides. Satellite camps near Adi in northern Côte d'Ivoire, new military outposts in Senegal, and joint exercises in Benin were cited as proof that the noose was tightening. To many outside observers, this rhetoric seemed alarmist. But to Burkinabè citizens who had lived through waves of terror attacks, it rang true. They knew that destabilization doesn't always arrive with uniforms, sometimes it wears a handshake. As public sentiment rallied around the president, a profound political shift began to take root. The once fragmented Burkinabè parliament, already weakened by the transitional framework, saw a surge in nationalist unity. Regional governors and local chiefs organized public declarations of loyalty. Youth groups dressed in the national colors marched through Ouagadougou chanting "On se forme en Burkinabè," "We train as Burkinabè." This spirit of resistance came with a social cost. Civil society organizations warned of rising xenophobia toward Ivorian traders and migrants inside Burkina Faso. A few incidents of harassment were reported in southern towns, though Traoré's government quickly condemned them, reminding the public, "Our fight is not against peoples, but against systems." It was a delicate balancing act, defending sovereignty without igniting hatred. Diplomatically, the fallout was immediate. Several embassies reduced staff and regional meetings became tense. The African Union urged calm and dialogue based on mutual respect. ECOWAS, increasingly viewed by many as a tool of foreign influence, found itself powerless to mediate. Behind the scenes, Western diplomats expressed frustration not only at Traoré's tone, but at his independence. "He refuses our aid, yet demands to be heard," one EU official lamented. For Traoré, this isolation was a badge of honor. "We must be ready to stand alone," he told his cabinet. "No nation can be free if it depends on the approval of those who profit from its weakness." His focus turned inward, strengthening domestic industries, reorganizing the army, and promoting what he called une armée du peuple, a people's army capable of resisting both insurgency and manipulation. Among ordinary citizens, something changed too. The fear that once kept people silent began to dissolve. Taxi drivers quoted their president's words. Teachers used his speeches as examples of civic duty. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso's revolution felt like more than a slogan, it was becoming a lived reality. And yet beneath that patriotic pride, a quieter truth lingered: revolutions always come at a cost. The question now was whether the nation could bear it and whether the people would still stand behind Ibrahim Traoré if the storm truly arrived. In Washington, the news of Ibrahim Traoré's remarks arrived quietly, first as a classified diplomatic cable, then as a topic in think tank discussions across the Potomac. Analysts at the Pentagon and the State Department were divided. Some dismissed it as another outburst from a populist military leader. Others saw something far more significant, a declaration that the old order in West Africa was slipping away. For decades, the United States and its European allies had relied on a network of cooperative governments to manage security in the Sahel. France provided troops, the US supplied intelligence and training, the region's presidents in return maintained predictable policies and open markets. But Traoré's words cut straight through that arrangement. When he said, "They told us not to build strong armies because they want to remain our guardians," it wasn't just a criticism, it was an indictment of the entire Western model of African security. At the Brookings Institution, one analyst warned that Burkina Faso's rhetoric risks dismantling decades of Western influence faster than any terrorist group could. But another at the Council on Foreign Relations countered, "Perhaps we are finally hearing the voice of a generation that no longer wants to be managed." Across the Atlantic in Paris, the reaction was sharper. French commentators accused Traoré of feeding anti-French hysteria, but the tone of condescension backfired. On social media, Africans across the diaspora mocked the criticism. They call it hysteria when Africans think independently. One post read, "Gaining thousands of shares among communities from Dakar to Detroit." In Moscow and Beijing, however, the speech was received with quiet approval. Russian media outlets portrayed Traoré as the new symbol of anti-imperialist defiance. Chinese commentators framed his rhetoric as proof that the post-colonial generation is maturing. Neither country officially endorsed his accusations, but both recognized the opportunity, a shifting center of gravity in West Africa that could open doors for new partnerships beyond Washington and Paris. Meanwhile, inside the United Nations, the mood was cautious. Diplomats avoided naming Burkina Faso in public statements, but several admitted privately that the Sahel's security vacuum had become a moral question. If the West fails to provide stability, one African envoy said then it should not condemn those who try to build it themselves. Among ordinary Americans, especially older citizens who had lived through the Cold War, Traoré's story evoked a strange familiarity. They remembered leaders once demonized for standing up to powerful systems: Nasser in Egypt, Lumumba in Congo, Sankara in Burkina Faso itself. The pattern seemed to repeat: a young African leader demanding dignity, accused of defiance and surrounded by invisible enemies. Television commentators debated whether Traoré's strategy was bravery or recklessness. Fox News framed it as a drift toward authoritarian isolation, while independent outlets like Democracy Now! Emphasized his calls for self-reliance and sovereignty. The split mirrored the world's confusion. Was Burkina Faso rejecting democracy or redefining it? In a global landscape fractured by proxy wars and resource politics, Traoré's confrontation with Côte d'Ivoire had become more than a local feud. It was a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truth that Africa's struggle for independence had never really ended. It had only changed shape. And as one retired U.S. colonel told The Washington Post, "We may be witnessing the birth of a new kind of African leader, one who doesn't ask for permission. For some, that was a threat. For others, it was the long-delayed beginning of freedom." The press conference ended, but the tremor it unleashed kept echoing across continents. In Burkina Faso, people replayed the footage again and again, a young president calm, yet unyielding, saying words that most African leaders would never dare speak on camera. "We are not children," he said. "We can think for ourselves." Outside Africa, many dismissed it as defiance. But to millions of Africans, especially those who remember what dependency has cost their nations, it felt like awakening. Traoré's declaration was not only about Côte d'Ivoire or terrorism, it was about dignity, about refusing to be policed, lectured, and contained by systems that have never truly seen Africa as equal. Yet revolutions do not end with applause. They test loyalty, patience, and belief. Burkina Faso now faces an uncertain road, cut off from old allies, surrounded by suspicion, and challenged to prove that sovereignty is more than a slogan. The danger is real. Isolation can breed instability, and economic hardship can erode even the purest ideals. But Traoré's defiance has already changed the tone of African politics. Across the Sahel, young officers and civic groups echo his message: no more dependence, no more deception. In Mali and Niger, murals of the Burkinabè flag appear on city walls. In Ghana and Senegal, university debates now cite Traoré's speeches alongside those of Sankara and Nkrumah. Whether the world agrees with him or not, his words have rekindled something powerful: the conviction that Africa can define its own destiny even if the path is steep. For American viewers, especially those over 60 who have seen history repeat itself, this moment may feel hauntingly familiar. The same fear once used to justify intervention abroad is now being recycled in Africa: stability first, freedom later. But can true stability ever come without freedom? Can a continent find peace while its sovereignty is negotiated in foreign capitals? That is the question Ibrahim Traoré forces us to confront. His warnings are not just for Burkina Faso, they are for every nation that has traded dignity for dependence. So tonight, as you reflect on his words, ask yourself, do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's revolution will endure, or will it be drowned by the same forces that silenced so many before him? Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to understand what's really unfolding in West Africa. And subscribe if you believe that the truth, not the headlines, is what history will remember. Because what happens next in Burkina Faso will not only define the future of one nation, it may define the courage of an entire continent.